The first black SUV slid into the dusty street like a shadow. Then came another, then a third, and just like that, a street where no one ever looked twice turned quiet. Too quiet. Engines hummed low. Tires crunched gravel. The sun glared off tinted windows that hid the faces inside. The sachet water vendor stopped mid-transaction. The conductor paused with one foot on his bus. Even the rusty generator behind the food kiosk, which had screamed all day, seemed to hold its breath. And there, in the heat haze near a rusted zinc fence, the old woman stood up. She moved slowly, like her bones still remembered poverty, but her spine had just remembered who she was. Her hands, which had been stretched out for hours, now dropped to her sides. She wiped her cheeks, straightened her torn ankara, and lifted her chin. No one had looked at her all day. Now everyone was staring. Simon stood a few steps away, frozen. Just minutes ago, she had looked like every other person Lagos didn't have time for. Tired, lost, dusty. She had whispered for help, barely audible over the street noise. Her eyes had begged louder than her voice. And yet, people had walked past like she didn't exist. But Simon didn't. He'd been on his way home, another fruitless day at his garage, another evening facing hunger. He had $6 left and had planned to buy himself something decent to eat for once. A simple meal, jollof rice, chicken, maybe a cold bottle of water. He'd even imagined sitting on the floor of his tiny room and savoring every bite. But then he saw her. She was curled in the dust, ignored, invisible. Her lips moved. Please, anything. No one cared. One man hissed at her. A woman pulled her child away in disgust. People dodged her like she was a pothole. Simon paused. Everything inside him said, "Not today. You barely have anything. Keep walking." But he didn't. He bought the food he had wanted for himself. Jollof, a piece of chicken, water, and brought it to her. She didn't understand at first. Her hand shook as she took the bag. "Why?" she asked. Simon just smiled weakly. "Eat well, Ma." He didn't expect thanks. He didn't expect anything. He just knew that she needed it more than he did. That was all. Now, that same woman was standing tall. And from the black SUVs, men in black suits stepped out with trained precision. One of them bowed. "Good afternoon, Ma," he said like she was royalty. Simon's head spun. The woman turned, not to the street, not to the crowd, but to him. Her eyes were full, not with hunger anymore, but with something deeper, something like relief. "Simon," she said, her voice gentle, steady. "You have passed the test." His heart thudded. What test? Before she could answer, a driver rushed from the largest SUV, nearly tripping over himself. "Madam, we've been looking." She raised a hand. He stopped immediately. She turned back to Simon. The crowd was growing now. The same people who'd ignored her were pressing forward, craning their necks, trying to understand. Simon wanted to disappear. His hands were still stained with engine oil. His shirt was damp with sweat. He looked like everything she was not. He remembered when he saw her first. How people walked past her like she was nothing. How her eyes had begged for help that never came. He had seen hunger before. He knew it too well. Not the kind of hunger where you still have rice at home. The kind where your stomach eats itself. The kind that makes your head light and your thoughts dark. That's the hunger she'd had. That's why he'd stopped. Now here she was, dressed in rags, but commanding guards and luxury vehicles. Nothing made sense. Then she reached into her handbag, the same dusty one that had sat beside her all day, and pulled out a phone. Not a cheap phone, not something borrowed or dying. A sleek, expensive device that shimmered even in the heat. She tapped the screen, lifted it to her ear. Her voice, though still soft, now held authority. "Driver," she said, "I'm at the dusty road, near the small restaurant. Come now." She ended the call. Simon blinked. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't madness. This was real. His voice cracked. "Madam, who are you?" She stepped closer. Her eyes searched his face. "My name is Sandra Ebique," she said slowly. "I'm the CEO of Sander Group of Companies." Simon stared at her. He knew that name. He had seen it on buildings, on TV, on billboards. She was a billionaire, and he had just spent his last $6 on her. "No," he whispered. "Yes," she said. "That's me." Then she turned, pointed to the line of SUVs, and said the sentence that would split his life in two. "Come with me, Simon." The crowd gasped. "Nah, film. Jazz. This is prank ABI." Simon's thoughts raced. His throat was dry. Everything inside him screamed that this moment wasn't for him. He wasn't the guy who gets picked. He wasn't special. He was just trying to survive. But her hand was outstretched. He reached for it. And that's when the voice exploded from the crowd. "Madam, don't go with him." Gasps. A man shoved forward, sweating, angry, pointing straight at Simon. "That boy's a thief," he shouted. "He's pretending. He's dangerous." Simon's blood froze. The woman didn't move, but her face changed. She looked at the man with the cold stare of someone used to lies. Her voice dropped. "Who are you?" she asked slowly. "And why are you lying about Simon?" The street went still. Even the heat seemed to pause. The man stuttered, I'm just trying to help." Simon recognized him. Last week. A customer. A Toyota. The man had argued about payment. Refused to pay. Threatened him. Simon pointed, voice shaking. You're the one with the Toyota. You said I'd regret it." The crowd murmured louder now. The man snapped. "He's trying to flip the story. He steals parts. He's a fraud." Simon felt his chest tighten. "That's a lie. I swear. I've never stolen anything." Madame Sandra raised her hand again. Her voice didn't rise. It sliced. "Search his words," she said. "Not his noise." Her security stepped forward. The man tried to run. They caught him. Struggled. Screamed. They took his phone. And inside, messages. Mentions of Sandra. Mentions of Simon. Instructions. The woman looked at the screen, then at the man. Then she nodded once, as if confirming what she already suspected. She turned to Simon again. "Do you still want to get in the car?" she asked. Simon's world was spinning, his stomach empty, his limbs shaking, but his heart said yes. He nodded. "Yes, madam," he said. "I'll go with you." The door of the black SUV closed behind Simon with a soft but definite click, a sound so final it carved itself into his bones. In an instant, the dusty street, the shouting crowd, the noise and confusion became distant, like a scene viewed through thick tinted glass. Inside, the air was cool and silent. Simon swallowed hard. He sat across from the woman who had just rewritten the rules of his life. She didn't look like someone dangerous. Not exactly. Her features were calm, refined, a quiet strength laced with something mysterious. But Simon could sense the tension in the tight line of her shoulders, the barely noticeable tightening of her jaw. His own hands still trembled. He stared at them, at the smudges of oil on his palms, at the scars and tiny burns that came from years of working with his bare hands. He felt exposed, like a child who had been pulled onto a stage before he'd learned how to speak in front of people. "Sit," she said, not commanding but gentle, deliberate. Simon sank into the soft leather seat. His heart thudded so loud he was sure she could hear it. For a moment, they just looked at each other in silence. The SUV glided through traffic smoothly, elegantly, without a single honk. Legos buzzed outside, horns and shouts and dust, a world that seemed too busy for miracles. "You look like you want to jump out," she finally said. Simon managed a shaky laugh. I've never been inside a car like this," he admitted, voice low. She turned her gaze forward, her eyes reflective. "You will get used to it," she said. "But that's not the real gift." Simon blinked at her words, uncertain what she meant. Did she mean the car? The food? The sudden comfort that now draped around him like a blanket he had never known? She sighed, a sound that seemed to carry years of weariness and wisdom at once. "Today, Simon, you did what most people will never do," she said softly. "You saw a person in need and treated her with dignity." Simon's throat tightened, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. I just did what felt right," he said. "No," she countered, but her voice wasn't harsh. "You did what courageous people do. Most people are afraid. Afraid to stop, afraid to help, afraid to be inconvenienced. What you did, that's rare." Simon looked out the window at the blur of color and life. Okadas weaving past, old shops, peeling paint, sunburned walls. He felt small. In fact, he had spent most of his life feeling small. But something in her eyes told him this moment, however terrifying, was not a mistake. Then her expression shifted. Her gaze grew serious. Her voice, once warm, turned firm. "I came today for more than just a test," she said. Simon's pulse quickened. She looked at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "People have been trying to destroy my company," she said, eyes steady. "They want to make the public hate me. They want to ruin me." Simon blinked, confused. "Why?" he asked. "You're one of the richest people in the country. Why would anyone want to do that?" She exhaled slowly. "Because I refused to sign a deal, a very lucrative one for my competitors, that would have cost thousands of workers their jobs." Simon's jaw dropped. "So they want revenge?" "More than that," she said quietly. "They want to control the narrative." He frowned. "What narrative?" She looked out the window for a moment, thoughtful. "Imagine this," she said. "If I had walked up to you today and begged you for money, and you had taken advantage of that, they would have recorded it. They would have said you were scamming me. They would have said I was weak and gullible. They would have used it." Simon felt sick. "I could have been arrested." "Worse," she said. "I would have lost everything I've built." The car slowed, approaching a crossroads. Simon's mind was racing faster than the vehicle. She pointed to the water bottle he had bought her. "That water," she said, "might look small to you." Simon blinked. "It is small," he murmured. She shook her head. "No, it is proof. Proof of who you are." Simon felt something heavy rise in his chest, something strange, warm, frightening. And he realized he couldn't deny the truth. He hadn't helped her for money. He had helped her because it was right. "And I want to change your life, Simon," she said. Those words landed like thunder. He heard them, but didn't understand them yet. She turned toward the front of the SUV. "Driver," she said. "Yes, madam," came the respectful reply. "Take us to his workshop," she said. "I want to see where he works." Simon stared at her like she was describing a trip to the moon. "My workshop," he echoed, voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she said simply. "Your workshop." The driver nodded and steered them through the busy streets of Lagos. Simon felt his breath catch. What was happening? Was this real? One moment he had been worried about food. The next, he was inside a luxury SUV, being driven by a billionaire CEO to his own place of struggle. His heart twisted. What would she think when she saw it? The workshop was nothing more than a shack disguised as ambition. A crooked signboard, rusty tools, a leaking roof. 2 broken cars slumped beside it like tired animals. As the SUV pulled up, everything froze again. People around stopped their work. Mechanics dropped their tools mid-motion. Some stared openly. Others whispered to each other. A few grabbed their phones. And across the road, a dark car slowed, parked, and its windows slid down. Men in plain shirts stepped out like they belonged to a different world, calm, neat, clean. Dangerous. Simon felt his pulse leap into his throat. Madame Sandra stepped out of the SUV first, poised and unshaken. The guards formed a perimeter, scanning the street. Simon exhaled unevenly. "Madam," one of the guards murmured. "They're approaching." She didn't flinch. "Let them come," she said. The men stopped several steps away. The leader, tall, smooth-faced, composed, smiled as though meeting an old acquaintance. "Madame Sandra," he said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Audie," she replied. "I wondered when you would appear." Addie's voice was calm, almost casual. "I'm not hiding. You sent that man," she said, referring to the one who had called Simon a thief. "You followed us here. What do you want?" Audie glanced at Simon, like sizing up something insignificant. "You're making noise, madam," he said. "This story of kindness, it's dangerous." "Dangerous?" Simon felt anger surge. "Dangerous to who?" he demanded before he could stop himself. Audie looked at him like he was an annoying mosquito. "To people who understand how the world works," he replied dismissively. Madame Sandra stepped closer, her voice sharp. "The world works because of people like him," she pointed at Simon. Audie's smile faltered. "You could have stayed quiet," he said. "Taken a deal. Let thousands lose their jobs." "Never," she said without hesitation. Addie's gaze shifted to Simon's workshop. "This workshop," he said calmly, "will never become anything." Simon felt his fist clench. Madame Sandra laughed once, softly but coldly. You think you can stop me? Audie leaned closer. Accidents happen, he murmured. Buildings collapse. Plans fail. People disappear. For the first time, Simon felt real fear. Madame Sandra didn't blink. She reached in her bag and pulled out a small recorder. You should choose your words carefully, she said. Everything you've said has been recorded. Audie froze. She pressed a button. A tiny red light glowed. Audie's face flickered. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police. He turned. This isn't over, he snapped, pointing at Simon. He'll regret this. Then he rushed back to the dark car. The guards watched as the vehicle sped off, tires slicing dust into the air. Simon stood rooted. Madame Sandra approached him. Are you okay? She asked, her voice calm but concerned. I think so, he whispered. But why involve me in all this? She looked at the workshop, cracked walls, rusty tools, peeling paint. Because your life is already changing, she said. And when light appears, darkness always fights back. Simon's stomach tightened. They will try again, he said. She nodded. Yes, they will. Then she said something that made his breath catch. Simon, from today, your life is connected to mine. He didn't know what that meant yet. But one thing was certain. His world had just become a battlefield. Simon leaned against the side of his workshop, his heart pounding like a relentless drum. The wind carried the smell of oil and rust, familiar scents that once comforted him. Now they felt like chains. His mind was spinning faster than the Lagos traffic, and he could almost hear the echoes of yesterday's dreams clashing with the reality of today. Madame Sandra stood beside him, calm, composed, regal in her quiet way. The guards were still positioned around, eyes alert, weapons discreet but unmistakable. The street buzzed with whispers. People pointed, phones recorded. Some stared with envy, others with fear. A few even smiled in disbelief. But beneath all that noise, one truth sat heavy in Simon's chest. Everything had changed. He watched Sandra survey his workshop, the peeling paint, the cracked pillars, the guttering roof, and feared she might recoil. But she didn't. Instead, she seemed to absorb it all the way a gardener absorbs winter frost, with patience and resolve. You built this with your hands, she said, her voice steady over the hum of the street. Simon blinked, confused. It's not much, he murmured. It's more than most people have, she replied. Before he could process her reply, a man in a white helmet and a clean vest stepped forward, holding a stack of rolled blueprints. The crowds parted like water, whispering as he approached. Madame Sandra, he said respectfully, bowing slightly. As instructed, Madame Sandra turned to Simon with a kind expression. This is Inra Baymidel, she said, my chief construction engineer. Inra unrolled the papers on the hood of a nearby car. Simon leaned in, his breath catching like a child peeking at a secret. What he saw made his eyes widen. The drawings depicted a new workshop. Not a shack, not a tin-roof shelter, but something modern, strong, substantial. Steel beams, proper lifts, neat floors, glass offices, bright lights, space for apprentices, room for innovation. Is this for me? Simon whispered, scarcely daring to breathe. Yes, Madame Sanders said simply. This will be Simon Odo's workshop. Simon's throat tightened, his vision blurred, not with shame, but disbelief. Hope, something he had almost forgotten existed. Before he could speak, a sudden bang echoed down the street. A loud metallic explosion that sounded too close. Simon jumped. Guards drew their weapons, forming a tighter perimeter. People gasped. Some cried out. What was that? Simon asked, voice shaky. A guard sprinted back toward them, face ashen. Madam, there's a fire. 2 streets away. Fire. Simon echoed. Yes, the guard confirmed. A warehouse is burning. Madame Sandra's eyes narrowed. That is a warning, she said. Simon felt his stomach drop. A warning for who? For you, she replied. Then, with a glance at him that felt heavy and earnest, she added, and for me. Sirens wailed in the distance. Not police this time, but fire trucks racing toward the blaze. People in the crowd backed away, shaking their heads. This place is cursed, one muttered. We should leave. Simon felt panic rising. What if they burned his workshop? His only achievement, his sweat, his life. Madame Sandra didn't flinch. "They won't," she said. "Not now." She pulled out her phone and dialed swiftly. Her voice was calm as she spoke, a calm he had never known, not even in his quietest moments of prayer. "Proceed with Phase 2, she said. Simon blinked. "Phase 2? What does that mean?" he asked, his voice almost lost beneath the sirens that now merged into a distant roar. Madame Sandra didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned to Enra. "Start tomorrow morning," she said. "No delays. Full security." "Yes, madam," Enra replied, nodding. Simon watched her step forward, no fear in her eyes. Then she raised her voice toward the crowd that had gathered, brimming with anxious whispers. "Listen," she said, stronger than the noise around her. "This workshop belongs to an honest man. Anyone who touches it will answer to the law." Some in the crowd clapped. Others stepped back, uncertain. Simon felt a strange mix of pride and terror. The sun began its descent, stretching long shadows across the street. Madame Sandra turned toward him. "You will not sleep here tonight," she said. Simon frowned. "But my room," he began. "It's not safe," she interrupted gently. "You will come with me." His heart lurched. "With you?" he echoed. "Yes," she said. "Just for tonight." Simon hesitated. He had never left his place for anything more than a small trip to the market. The idea of stepping into her world, into her life, was both thrilling and terrifying. Madame Sandra softened her voice. "Simon," she said, "sometimes God moves us out so he can move us up." Simon locked eyes with her and slowly nodded. He locked his workshop door carefully, his palms trembling so hard it felt like his own hands were strangers. This place, cracked, humble, imperfect, had been his entire world. Now he wasn't sure when he'd see it again. The SUV pulled up. Simon stepped inside and glanced back once more. The guards stayed behind, silent protectors in the gathering dusk. The street lights flickered on, struggling to pierce the thickening night. Inside the vehicle, it was quiet. Then Madame Sandra spoke. "Simon," she said, "do you know why I chose you?" Simon shook his head. "Because you didn't ask for anything," she said. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect thanks. You didn't expect reward." She paused, her eyes steady on the passing lights outside. When people think they are alone, they show who they truly are. Simon swallowed. His heart pounded, but his voice was quiet. "Madam," he asked, "why were you really on that dusty road?" Madame Sandra closed her eyes briefly, a rare glimpse of vulnerability. "When I was young," she said slowly, "I begged. Not for attention, not for sympathy, just for help." Simon turned sharply. She sighed, heavy, personal. "Nobody helped me," she whispered. "Not a single person. They stepped over me like I was just another piece of dirt." Her voice broke just once. "That day," she continued, "I promised myself, if I ever rose, I would never forget the invisible." Simon didn't know why, but his throat stung. The SUV slowed. Lights appeared ahead. Tall gates, bright lamps, a mansion vast enough to swallow his entire workshop. Simon stared, utterly speechless. As the gates opened, Sandra's phone buzzed. She read the message. Her face changed. "What is it?" Simon asked, nervous. "They've made their next move," she said. Simon's breath caught. "What did they do?" "They filed a false report," she said slowly, "claiming you're involved in a financial scam." Simon felt like the air had been punched out of his lungs. "A scam?" he whispered. "That's a lie." "I know," she replied calmly. "But the police are on their way." Simon's hands shook uncontrollably. Madame Sandra placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Do not be afraid," she said. "This is exactly what I expected." The gates closed behind them. Sirens echoed once more. And as they pulled into the courtyard, Madame Sandra spoke words that made Simon's blood run cold. "By tomorrow morning," she said, "your name will be everywhere." Simon could not sleep. Not when his name was everywhere. Not when his face glared back at him from every corner of his phone screen. Headlines screaming accusations, rumors, questions, fear shaped into words. Billionaire scandal, mechanic implicated in fraud. Who is Simon, and why is he under a billionaire's protection? He sat on the edge of the wide bed in the guest room of Madame Sandra's mansion. The silken sheets beneath him felt strange, unfamiliar. Just hours ago, he had worried about rice on the floor. Now he worried about his name becoming a storm. Outside, security whispered orders. Phones chattered. Calm voices moved like clockwork. It was a silent hurricane of control. Everything organized, precise, unshakable. But inside Simon's chest, chaos roared. He checked his phone again. News alerts, notifications, voices he'd never met talking about him, like he was already a story finished before it began. Madame Sandra appeared in the doorway, poised, composed, the eye of all storms. "You didn't sleep," she said gently. Simon exhaled, rubbed his eyes. "How could I?" She sat beside him, calm and patient. "This morning," she began, "was loud. The world got noisy. But noise doesn't mean truth." Simon looked at her, eyes weary yet burning with fear. "But what if people believe it? What if they think I really did something wrong?" She didn't flinch. "Listen," she said, voice steady. "Your name is everywhere because people are curious, not because they believe lies." Simon swallowed. "But tomorrow, what then? What if the lies take hold?" She reached out, touching his shoulder with a confidence that felt like armor. "Truth has weight, Simon, and truth doesn't hide. We will face this together." Then came the siren, not outside, but in Simon's head. The police had arrived, they said, respectful, formal, with a question in their eyes and procedure in their pockets. Madame Sandra stood and walked toward the door, composed, dignified. Simon followed. In the living room, 3 officers stood at attention, calm, professional, waiting. The lead officer bowed his head slightly in respect. "Madame Sandra," he said, "we have received the complaint." Simon felt his knees buzz. He stood next to her, small, unsure, exposed to the glare of authority. Madame Sandra nodded. "And I received your visit," she said. She gestured toward the table and placed a tablet on it. Photos, recordings, messages, conversations, dates, times, names, clear evidence. One by one, she played the recordings. Adi's voice echoed through the speakers. Threats, manipulation, plans of ruin, admissions of sabotage. The officer's face changed. He looked from the screen to Sandra, then to Simon. "Madam," he said slowly, careful, "this changes everything." Simon felt something unlock inside him, a breath he'd forgotten he was holding. The officer turned to Simon. "You are free to go," he said. "This report is false." Relief hit Simon like water. Tears spilled, not from joy, not entirely, but from the shock of truth returning to the land of the living. Madame Sandra watched quietly. Simon tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, to thank, but the raw emotion made his voice tremble. He simply muttered, "Thank you." The officer left. Everything outside the mansion seemed to exhale, like clouds releasing tension after a storm. That same afternoon, a press conference was called. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Microphones leaned forward like they could taste every word. Madame Sandra stood at the podium, poised and articulate. "I dress like a beggar," she said. Her voice was strong, measured, dignified. Not to shame anyone, but to search for humanity. Silence fell, heavy, focused. She continued. "I was ignored by many," she said, "but helped by one." She turned toward Simon. Simon froze, his hands shaking, his face pale, his clothes simple and humble among the polished suits and bright lights. The crowd literally gasped. She lifted her chin. "This young man," she said, pointing at Simon, "used his last $6 to buy food for a stranger he did not know, a stranger he had never met." Flashbulbs popped. Reporters leaned closer. "He did not help because he expected reward," she continued. "He helped because it was right." The narrative shifted in that moment. What had started as scandal began to transform into a story of courage, integrity, humanity. Headlines changed. Voices turned. "Poor mechanics, kindness shocks nation." $6 that change a life. Billionaire rewards honesty. Simon watched as his old workshop, once crooked and dusty, began its transformation. Bulldozers cleared rust and rubble. Steel frames rose. Workers moved with purpose. New machines arrived. and people came from all corners of Lagos asking, "Is this Simon Odo's workshop?" For the first time, Simon wasn't worried about food, but something else stirred deep within him. Fear, not of danger, not of rumors, but fear of change. Fear that he might lose the very thing that had made him kind in the first place. 1 month later, the sun shone over a newly built structure taller and stronger than Simon had ever dreamed. A banner unfurled proudly, commissioning of Simon Odo's workshop, a center of excellence. The crowd gathered, music, laughter, cheering, radio announcements, local dignitaries, investors, young mechanics hopeful for apprenticeships. Simon stood beside Madame Sandra, overwhelmed, speechless. "This is dream," he murmured. She smiled, not grandly, but quietly, like someone who had seen storms and knew the sun would rise again. "No," she said, "this is reward." She handed him a large brass key. Simple, heavy, symbolic. "For you," she said. Simon's hands trembled as he took it. "This place is yours," she said. "Run it with the same heart that bought food for a stranger." Simon nodded, tears rolling freely now. "I promise," he said. "I will never forget." The ribbon was cut. Applause roared. And as the crowd cheered, Simon looked around at the shining workshop, at the people who had come, at the future widening before him, and finally understood something he had never fully known before. Kindness is never small. It waits, waiting to meet the right moment, waiting to meet the right heart. And when it does, it changes everything. But as Simon watched the crowd, his phone buzzed. A message, a warning. Someone was watching, someone who had not given up. And the name that appeared on the screen made his blood run cold. "We meet again." Simon stood at the threshold of his new workshop, the polished glass doors reflecting a sky so bright it hurt to look at. The construction workers were packing up for the day. The last of the banners still fluttered in the breeze, proclaiming Simon Odo's workshop, a center of excellence. The sound of celebration from yesterday still hummed in the air like aftertaste. He breathed deeply, not with relief, but with tension, because the world had changed around him, but inside him something still felt perilous, uncertain. His phone buzzed again. "We meet again." Those words glared at him from the screen like a threat they had whispered into his future. A chill slithered up his spine that no success, no crowd, no ribbon, no headlines could banish. Madame Sandra appeared beside him, quiet and poised. She wore that calm expression she always had, even when storms crashed at her heels. Today was no different. "You saw the message," she said, matter of fact. Simon nodded, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Yes," he said, "but what do I do?" She looked out at the street. Tidy, midday, noisy, ordinary, but with that faint shimmer beneath the surface of danger. "You do what you've always done," she said. "You don't run." He let out a breath that felt heavy, like he had been holding it since the dusty road where it all started. "Walk with me," she said. They walked through the workshop, machines humming, apprentices learning, new cars being lifted and inspected by young hand Simon once assumed would never have this chance. He watched them with awe, and for the first time not with disbelief, with responsibility. Responsibility, a word heavier than any burden he had felt before. But just then his phone buzzed again, persistent, insistent. It was a video message. He hesitated, then played it. The screen went black for a moment. Then a face flickered into view, a man he had seen before. Not once, but now with a different expression. Rage, frustration, defeat. "Simon Odo," the man said, voice low and controlled. "You think this is over? You think a ribbon today erases what you did?" Simon felt his stomach fall. He didn't recognize the background. A dim room, walls closing in, shadows flickering in the corners. The man's eyes glowed with bitter fire. "You took what was meant to be ours," he continued. "You took a story, a chance, a legacy. And now we want what remains." The video ended suddenly, like someone had smacked the phone and walked away. Simon stared at the blank screen. Madame Sandra watched quietly. Her silence was not empty. It was calculating. Then she spoke. "It's time," she said. "Time for what?" Simon whispered. "Time to show them she replied. What truth looks like when it stands unshaken. He looked around the workshop, at the apprentices, at the machines, at the signs of promise everywhere, and realized he could not go back to living in a shadow of fear. Not now. Not ever. That afternoon, the governor of Lagos came, formal, serious, respectful. He stood beside Simon at a press event, cameras flashing like thunderbolts, and spoke with reverence. This workshop, the governor said, represents what this city values. Honesty, resilience, ingenuity. Reporters leaned in. Is Mr. Odo safe? One asked. Protected, another said. Is the threat real? Someone called. The governor's voice was steady. He is a citizen of Lagos, he said, and no false accusation will stand against him. The world watched. The headlines changed again. Not as quickly as before. Truth is never in a rush, but perceptibly. People began to speak differently. Hero mechanic defies scandal. False accusations fail. Community rallies behind Simon Odo. Simon felt something rise in his chest that was not fear. Pride, but not the kind accompanied by arrogance. It was pride steeped in humility. Madame Sandra watched him from the sidelines, her gaze serene. When the crowd thinned, she approached. You've done what needed to be done, she said quietly. Simon nodded, eyes on the ground. But I still fear, he admitted. I fear what's next. She placed a steady hand on his shoulder, a gesture as firm as steel and as gentle as dawn. Fear lives in everyone, she said. The difference between those who rise and those who fall is not the absence of fear. It is what you do with it. Simon thought of the dusty road, of the moment he chose kindness over hunger, of the first black SUV slicing through the heat, of headlines that try to drown him, of people who believed and those who did not. He thought of every moment, every choice that led him here, and he realized something remarkable. Fear had never been the danger. Inaction was. The workshop thrummed with life. Apprentices called greetings. Cars lifted. Engines purred to life under skillful hands. Simon inhaled deeply. He didn't know exactly what tomorrow held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would face it, not with fear, but with intention. That afternoon, as the sun dipped and stretched long shadows across the workshop floor, Simon walked to the center of the new building. Workers paused, watching him. Apprentices held their breath. Reporters hovered on the edges. Simon took the microphone. His voice was steady, not strong, not booming, but honest. Today, he said, I stand here not because I was chosen, but because someone once chose kindness. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. He paused, eyes wide, heart open. I wasn't searching for fame, he added. I was searching for respect. Not the kind shouted by crowds, but the kind earned in silence. People nodded. Some wiped tears. Some smiled. Some simply listened. And in that moment, Simon understood something far larger than himself. Truth is not just a shield. It is a foundation. Later that evening, as the workshop lights glowed like stars against the darkening sky, Madame Sandra walked with him to his office, a small room at the back with a single window looking out at possibility. Simon sat at the desk, a simple desk, not luxurious, not imposing, but his. He opened his phone once more. A message blinked. It was from the lawyer handling his case. All accusations dropped. Full exoneration confirmed. Simon stared at the words. Peace washed over him. But he knew peace was not the end. It was only the beginning. He closed his eyes, then opened them, not to fear, not to uncertainty, but to the horizon of every moment yet unwritten. He whispered into the quiet room, let's build. And somewhere, in the warm hum of engines and the steady pulse of progress, the world seemed to quietly agree.